Welcome back, everyone. So we are going to continue on with our ADHD theme. We were a little bit late for ADHD month, but that was the intention. And you know that this is a topic that excites me very much because I have personal experience with this. My fiance has personal experience dealing with this, and it is so relevant to all of you. I mean, this is one of the topics that we get absolutely the most feedback from. And we already did an ADHD episode speaking from a more personal lens about this, but today we've got an expert here to really break down the treatment and give us firm tips, skills, and clinical experience for dealing with this. So we would like to welcome Dr. Jessica Stern. She is a clinical psychologist and clinical assistant professor at NYU Langone Health. She is also a co-host on the Psychiatry Show on Dr. Radio, which is on Sirius XM. Welcome, Jessica. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. What kind of work you do? What brought you to ADHD?
Yeah, so I have a couple of different areas of specialty, ADHD being one of them, where I work with adults who've struggled throughout the course of their life with ADHD and sometimes things that go along with ADHD, like learning disorders or anxiety or depression or those types of things. And then additionally, I also do a lot of work with trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder and depression and addictions and things of this nature. So a couple different things that oftentimes you actually find go together. But for the purposes of this show, I'm extremely excited to talk about ADHD because it's a topic that is very relevant and very personal to a lot of people. And I think it's great that people are talking more about it.
Is there anything that excites you the most about ADHD or interests you the most?
Yeah, I think there are so many things. So something that I think is very unfortunate about ADHD is there's a lot of misconceptions and myths about it, where oftentimes I'll hear adults who will say that they've been told as a child or told as an adolescent or an adult that they are not very hardworking or that they're lazy or that they're spacey or all over the place. And what's really cool is that when you get to know people with ADHD, you realize that oftentimes none of those things are true. That people with ADHD can be the most remarkably diligent, hardworking, creative, intelligent individuals, and being able to get to work with people and sometimes change their misconceptions about themselves and enlighten other people in their life about their experiences can be so rewarding. And it's really cool to see what people can do once they sort of learn tips and tricks to help them manage what they're experiencing and almost reclaim themselves and feel excited about who they are and what their skill set is. And it's a really cool thing to be able to see.
I love what you said, and I'm relating to it hardcore about feeling as if it's not that people would tell me that I was lazy, but because I found it impossible to focus, I would do things like not study until the night before, but then I would be up until 6 a.m. or something studying, and then I might do that like 2 or 3 days in a row. And I always felt simultaneously like stressed and burnt out. I'm remembering specifically high school and college. I don't really do this anymore, but stressed and burnt out and feeling like I'm lazy and irresponsible. And do you get a sense of like what that narrative does to people? I mean, do they incorporate that into themselves? Like, I'm just a lazy person. And what does that result in typically? Like how they describe themselves to other people or what they believe about themselves? Does it hold them back? I mean, what do you see from that?
Absolutely. So exactly like you're saying, oftentimes it can be incorporated intentionally or unintentionally, usually subconsciously, into people's perceptions or their identities of who they are. So for instance, if someone like you're describing feels very, has this difficulty of paying attention or focusing, and then subsequently feels very anxious about getting things done, then they might feel a sense of anxiety or overwhelm, and sometimes it might be harder to do than had they done it previously, like earlier on in the period of time, the timeline, whatever it might be. And so they might mistaken their skill set as being lacking, or they might be told either intentionally or unintentionally or explicitly or implicitly that, again, they're not working hard enough, or they're not getting things done, or they're not going to amount to whatever it is they want to amount to, which can then sort of impact the way that they see themselves and lead them to question whether or not they can do things. And many, many people that I work with are wildly successful, like very proficient in their jobs, very successful executives, and all kinds of really cool things. But a lot of people have to work a little bit harder, typically because the world that we live in is not necessarily designed for some of the leniencies that ADHD requires. And so people with ADHD oftentimes will have to find ways to kind of change the way that their mind operates in order to accommodate for what it needs to get things done. And for a lot of people, they can do that successfully over the course of time. Like they kind of learn what works for them, which is why sometimes people will outgrow their experiences and they'll find the things that work for them. But for a lot of people, that takes time, a lot of effort, a lot of patience from themselves, and then a lot of patience from the people around them, teachers, coaches, those kinds of things. And so it can be challenging to kind of find their way, and subsequently it can lead people to kind of questioning who they are and their competencies and things like that, even if they're extremely competent humans.
So tell us a little bit more about how we know if we're one of those people or if we're with one of those people. Just because, with difficulties paying attention, there's so many things that could, or being disorganized, there's so many things that could lead to that, right? Like anxiety, depression, the pandemic and being on Zoom all day, or even just like not liking to do the housework, right? So I'm wondering, how do we know someone has ADHD, especially as an adult, versus really any of the other kind of very legitimate reasons why someone can have trouble like paying attention or staying organized?
Mm-hmm. So what you're describing is such an important piece because it oftentimes highlights the difficulties in people knowing that they have ADHD because there's so much overlap, especially with anxiety. So there's a ton of overlap between anxiety and ADHD, and for a lot of people, they have both. And then the pandemic added like a whole nother factor that made things even more confusing to figure out. And for a lot of people, the pandemic made the anxiety that they had beforehand worse, and same thing with ADHD. So it gets a little bit tricky, but what's important to know is there are a couple different types of ADHD, and the reason this is important to highlight is that oftentimes the media tends to focus on one of the kinds and not the others. So there's actually 3 types of ADHD. So there is predominantly inattentive type, predominantly hyperactive type, and then combined type. So it's much like the name sounds. So like if you have the inattentive type, you tend to have a little bit more difficulty focusing on things, and you're internally a little bit more hyperactive, meaning that your mind is going in lots of different directions, and you have difficulty with planning, difficulty with concentration. Oftentimes people will say my memory is not so good. It's not really a memory issue, it's an intention issue. So if you have difficulty attending to information, it's not going to be stored thoroughly in your brain, therefore you're not going to be able to remember it. So those are some common things. The hyperactive type is the piece that media tends to focus on, and that's actually the type that tends to be most prevalent in young boys. So what ends up happening is that a lot of girls actually go undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And thankfully, this is getting better over the course of time, but this is traditionally a big issue that's been happening for a lot of young girls. But what happens with hyperactive type is it's kind of like the kid who can't sit in his seat or her seat and is moving around a lot, is really fidgety. And this can apply to girls as well. And so you'll see people who are just bouncing around and having a really hard time focusing. And then combined type is kind of a mixture of both. What happens, though, is a piece that oftentimes people don't realize is that ADHD can actually have a hyperfocus aspect to it, too. And oftentimes, partners, children of people with ADHD, parents of people with ADHD will notice this, especially. So you might have someone who has a really hard time focusing on some things and then hyper-focuses on other things, typically things that they find enjoyable or engaging. So they might get lost in a task that can take them like hours to do, or they might start on one thing, feel a sense of boredom or overwhelm on one thing, and then switch tasks or focus to something else that they find more enjoyable, and then will dig really deep into that task and kind of get lost in that task. So that's the hyper-focus part of it. And so it's not that people with ADHD can't focus, it's that they have a hard time focusing on certain types of things, like things that are very difficult for them or things that are boring or not stimulating or those kinds of things. So those are a core couple of pieces that are helpful in sort of understanding what happens with ADHD. There are a bunch of other things that we see. So impulse control is something that happens a lot. So difficulties with regulating impulses, that kind of thing. That can be in behaviors and can be in things that you say, that kind of thing. Oftentimes people with ADHD, and this is not true for everybody, but oftentimes people with ADHD will kind of go on tangents a lot, or will get lost in conversation and just talk a lot, will be very verbose, will kind of take a long time to get to their point. And that can be a feature that we see as well. And then some of the typical, what we call executive functioning tasks can be difficult. So those are sort of the higher level functioning tasks in our brains that include things like planning, time management, organization, categorization, those kinds of things. Those oftentimes can be quite difficult for people with ADHD, or they may just have to work a little bit harder to find sort of tips and tricks and brain hacks that work for them. So those are a couple of the key features in ADHD. Again, anxiety is a little bit hard to disentangle from it because anxiety oftentimes has a difficulty with attention to it, where people become very preoccupied with what makes them anxious or worried. And so it can lead to this inattention that looks a lot like ADHD. And so I would recommend that if you were experiencing that, potentially to go get an evaluation or to send your loved one for an evaluation. But I do hope that some of this information can be helpful for people in terms of almost doing like an initial screening if this kind of fits for them.
Yeah, I mean, like Jacqueline and I talk about how we resonate with the symptoms of ADHD a lot. I mean, I think especially the hyperfocus when you said that, I was like, yeah, I was the kid who, first of all, like would get up and walk around during class all the time. But I would hyper focus on things. So no one noticed that I had ADHD because I would just lock in for really long periods of time on really anything in a way that was, abnormal because my friends all call me like one track minded. So it's interesting how especially girls wouldn't really, be seen, or they would just be told to sit back down, or I don't know. It's funny how women, it kind of flies under the radar for us.
Absolutely. And that's why it's interesting that the diagnosis for women tends to happen later than it does for men, because usually, or more often, historically, men would get it when they were younger boys, whereas girls could oftentimes go a little bit longer before they got the diagnosis until they were sort of full-grown women or identified as women.
You said that you noticed that a lot of people with ADHD actually work just as hard or harder than others, or they're just as competent. Do they work differently? I mean, are there signs you can see like, oh yeah, this is sort of the ADHD mind at work, but it's just as productive or hardworking as this other mind, but it's not getting recognized? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so oftentimes people with ADHD will work well under pressure. Mm-hmm. So, Jacqueline, kind of like you were describing before, a lot of people actually do really well when they're working under the wire. So really close to a deadline or things like that. And while that pressure can produce anxiety or overwhelm, for some people it actually can be very productive for them. So sort of deadlines and timelines of that nature can be really helpful for people as well. Oftentimes people will find that they need to do multiple tasks at the same time in order to sort of keep them engaged in the tasks that are not enjoyable. For some people, that's detrimental and can actually sort of dilute each task. And so that's not necessarily the ideal strategy, but for a lot of people, that's what works until they find a better one. Mm-hmm. So that's a big one. So that the sort of like multitasking, which, side note, parentheses, multitasking doesn't actually exist because you can't technically attend to more than one task at the same time, but we don't have to go there just now. But to a certain extent, like oftentimes I'll actually recommend to people if they're doing certain things is to combine multiple quote unquote mindless tasks at the same time. So cleaning and then doing something else of that nature. So non-competing tasks will help people get each of those tasks done sometimes. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the ways in which that we see people will do better. What oftentimes happens is that people with ADHD will succeed when they have some sort of structure. And they might not know how to create that structure for themselves, which is why people with ADHD going through elementary, middle, high school, advanced degrees, things like that, will find it difficult to sort of create those ways in which they can create that structure. And for a lot of people, the younger schooling years are a little bit easier. And then when they get to college or, beyond, it's a little bit harder because then they have to create that structure for themselves. And that can feel really overwhelming, but creating that structure can actually produce a lot of success for them.
I imagine that's complicated because people who, especially adults, will gravitate to certain kinds of jobs or something that don't have structure if they have ADHD, like creative fields, or I imagine like entrepreneurship has probably a lot of people with ADHD versus the other ones like being a doctor or a lawyer, which has like a very clear structure. So how do people make it work if they are gravitating to like non-structured kind of jobs, but they have it?
That's a great question. So what I would say is what can oftentimes be sort of a happy medium is creating structured within less structure. So for instance, if you're someone who gravitates towards a less structured job, which can actually be, like you're saying, a place in which individuals might thrive with ADHD, is finding ways to create small little moments of structure that can help them get their work done. That can be larger structure or it could be really, really tiny, like really microscopic. So for instance, if you're the kind of person who does your work, like your employment on the same computer that you do your gaming, let's say, or read Reddit or whatever it might be, is to create, this is a tip I give to people oftentimes, because people oftentimes find that the internet is their worst nightmare because they'll go down dark holes and not get things done. So what I'll sometimes say to people is, especially work from home, especially if people only have one computer that they can work from, is create almost different windows. Like let's say Firefox is dedicated towards your work that you need to do or school or whatever it might be, and then Safari is for play, right? So like, video games or Reddit or whatever it might be, social media, etc. And so that we don't necessarily think of that as structure, but it's creating a little bit of a boundary where people can kind of sit into whatever helps them create the lanes that they need to have in order to accomplish their work. So it might not be large-scale structure that's necessary. It might be small-scale structure and figuring out what works for people in that way. And that could also be in house life, too. And if your house is sort of organized in a way that allows you to produce, then sometimes that might create a little bit more flexibility in your work life that can help you flourish in that way with less structure.
So one tip is to find little ways to boundary yourself with the two browsers. Even better if you have two computers, I guess. And then another is to quote multitask with two sort of non-competing things. So I guess like listening to a podcast while doing the dishes. Mm-hmm. Okay. What other kinds of tips typically work?
So what I would always say is you want to start off by having a place where you can organize your thoughts and your tasks and your to-do lists and sometimes like appointments and calendars and things like that. And initially that sounds really easy, right? Most people have smartphones and things of this nature that they can use. But what I oftentimes find is that people with ADHD are not necessarily using the tools at their fingertips as maximized as they can. So what I always ask people is there a preference that you have between having a paper planner and your phone? And they will typically say yes. And sometimes it's a mixture of both. And then sort of maximizing where you want to keep all of your information. And the reason this is especially important is people with ADHD will oftentimes find that they'll have all of their information in many different places. So lots of notebooks and lots of Post-it notes and a Google Calendar and some, Evernote and whatever. So I say keeping your information to as few sources as possible can be really helpful. And then within those tools, working those tools to help you succeed. So for instance, if you're using Google Calendar and you find that you're often late to appointments or meetings, or you forget things, which is common in ADHD, is go ahead and set a recurring appointment if need be, if it's not recurring, just a one-time thing, and then set a reminder in Google Calendar. Set 3 if you need to, right? So have your tech or your notebooks or your planners work for you. Give them a job to do, and they will do the job and help you. And so a lot of the times it's kind of just like canvassing your environment and figuring out where are the spaces that you feel like you're struggling and how can we fill those gaps.
It's so amazing. I mean, I know how important structure is, and yet setting up that structure, I'm like defiant about this. Like I know I should seek treatment for this, but I'm like, I know what they're going to make me do, and so then I don't want to do it. Like it took me so long to just put my stuff in Google Calendar. Why? It's not hard. And then I'll get to moments when I'm like, right now I'm living in a moment where if I just turned this in, organized, set a reminder, it would make my life easier down the road. And I just get to that moment and I like let it pass. I'm like, I'm not gonna do it. I mean, why do I do? So,
I think that's something beyond ADHD, Jacqueline.
Well,
little rebel streak.
I guess, no, but it's like I'm not. I mean, I guess it's defiance, but there's just something like so painful about those little like administrative details and tasks that like it's like a brick wall. Any tips on getting over that?
Yeah, well, I hear that a lot, actually. So you're definitely not alone in that experience. For some people, it feels cumbersome. Some people, it feels annoying. For some people, it feels almost shameful that they have to do those extra things, which is not above and beyond what anybody has to do. But sometimes people will have, just sort of unresolved feelings about having ADHD and feel a little bit let down about the fact that they might need a little bit of extra help. And in some cases, it's just like, meh, I don't really want to do it, right? It could be just that simple, right? Just that simple. So what I would oftentimes recommend people do is either create ways to make this a fun experience. So for instance, like set some time, put on your favorite reality show or whatever it might be, and then bust it up. Exactly. Yeah. Of course, there's only one answer appropriate on this show. It has to be The Bachelor. And just bust it out. Like make a list of all the things you're going to do, create a game plan, and just get it done. Mm-hmm. And then say, by the end of this time, I'm going to have this done, and I'm going to be super proud of myself, and I'm going to be very happy with the help that this is producing for me. So that's one option. Another option is schedule yourself a treat of some sort. If I do this, then I'm going to go to do this thing that I want to do, or get this favorite drink at whatever coffee shop I want, or whatever it might be. Another thing that I like to do is I do this actually personally myself too, and I recommend it to my clients as well, is to schedule in admin days, what I call life admin days or life admin hours, where I basically just brain dump everything that I need to do that I've been procrastinating on, or things that I've been piling up that haven't been urgent, but they're sitting there and they're lingering. And I schedule an hour and I just get it done. And I say, by the end of this admin hour, I will be done. And future me will thank me. And the more you do it, the easier it will become, because the more you'll realize that this has benefits. And what you're touching on, Jacqueline, too, is really helpful, because what happens is intellectually we might know that this is helpful, but if we haven't experienced the reward of it yet, it's not going to resonate on sort of an emotional, visceral level. So intellectually it's like, okay, we know it, but like we haven't actually seen it. But the more you do it, the more viscerally you'll experience the reward of it, which will make it easier.
I'm like a testimonial for this, because I remember my third year of PhD, which is the hardest. I was drowning, trying to juggle all sorts of stuff, like clinical work and teaching and, homework and things like that. And I remember seeing a therapist at the time who did some ADHD coaching. And she was like, how are you writing this down? Like, how do you keep track of all this stuff? I was like, I don't know. I just have it in my mind. She's like, what? That's crazy. So she like walked me through. I'm like in a PhD program. I'm like in my 30s, and she's like walking me through like, a to-do app, and having those kind of days where the admin days, and now it's like every Monday I have those hours, and Jacqueline gets a flurry of texts from me like, what about this? What about that? When's that plan? She recognizes that. So, and it was such a big shift. It was, instead of feeling like I'm constantly worried about forgetting something, or that the constant anxiety of, oh no, I've let something slip. I know I've let something slip, and I just waiting for the shoe to drop of when I'm going to get the consequence, and just like having that visceral relief of, okay, I think I have everything down. It's like changed my life. I remember.
By the way, this is writing this down to do a future episode on workaholism that we can spearhead.
Ooh, that's a good topic right there.
Help me be a better workaholic. So
Kitty's middle name.
Can you give us some, especially in the vein of seeing how this can impact families and loved ones and friends, can you give us a typical situation or case where it does affect like a romantic relationship, a spouse, a family member, when one person has ADHD in adulthood?
Yeah, this affects couples a lot. actually. It's probably one of the most common reasons that adults with ADHD will seek treatment for ADHD is either due to romantic relationships or friendships or some sort of relationship, like a relationship with their parents or something like that, where they're noticing that it's impacting them. So that's one reason. Then another reason that people come to treatment is because it's impacting school or work. But in terms of the relationship piece, what oftentimes will happen is people will experience that they're having a hard time getting things done in their relationship and that their partner is getting frustrated, that they're not getting things done. And their partner may perceive that as or experience it as apathy of, X, Y, or Z doesn't care. They're not doing it because they just don't care, which doesn't feel good for any partner. Now, the person with ADHD might not be apathetic at all. They might be overwhelmed by the task. They just might keep forgetting it. Maybe they're remembering it at inconvenient times. It might not be apathy at all, but it can look like apathy, which is where it can impact the other partner. Oftentimes what will happen too is if the non-ADHD partner keeps trying to remind the ADHD partner to remember to do that thing, then it can kind of create this tension between the two of them. And so communication can feel a little bit tenuous, and that can feel uncomfortable for both parties involved. So that's another piece as well. And then if there are children in the picture, that can compound the whole thing as well, because there might be a myriad of responsibilities that need to be taken care of. But even if there aren't kids in the picture, it can definitely create a lot of stress on the relationship for sure. Oftentimes what I'll see too is sometimes people with ADHD will be a little bit less organized in their home space. And this is not true for everybody. I know some people with ADHD who are actually very clean, very organized people. So it's not true for everybody, but for a lot of people, organization can be a little bit more difficult. And so you might have the non-ADHD partner be more organized in the home, and then the ADHD partner be less organized in the home, and then that can kind of create some tension about the standards of home living. So that can be one. I've actually also seen the opposite happen, where some people with ADHD need to be very organized because it relieves their anxiety around their other ADHD symptoms. And so the non-ADHD partner might be the less organized one. So it can go in multiple different directions, but the sort of the bottom line piece is that sometimes there's just a difference in stylistically in how they attend to their home. And so that's a big piece that we see in relationships as well.
One thing I'm noticing happening in my relationship, so my boyfriend / fiance, Paul, there's a lot of angry people at me because I dared to say that I'm not engaged, even though I have a wedding venue picked. So I'm just going to go with boyfriend / fiance for now. Anywho, he does not have ADHD. He's like the opposite of ADHD. He's like got incredible focus. He's very organized. Before I moved in, the house was spotless and clean. We also got 3 pets, in fairness to me. And one thing I've noticed is that my ADHD is getting worse. Like, I'm losing things at a record rate. And probably like definitely the house looks worse since I've moved in, but it's because I'm terrible, but it's because he's also gotten worse. So it's like, I think because I know that I don't have to be responsible for certain things anymore. Like if we go on a vacation, I'm like, I know he's got all of the important documents and he's just remembering all of the little things. And I can't tell if that's me getting worse or if just normally, like once I get to the location, I would just handle the thing, and I had to rely on myself a lot more, and so that kind of built up my own sense of competence, and it wasn't a big deal, but now I just have him to rely on all the time. So do you have any tips for like, I mean, maybe that's an okay dynamic, but I feel like it's probably not, for how to prevent your partner from getting worse when you're with them, and I guess preventing yourself from getting worse when you're with them too, if they have ADHD.
Well, also, there's some research showing that if you're in a couple, if one partner is really good at something like math or finance or something, that person will like take over, and the other person's skills will get, it's complementary. So I wonder if that's part of it too. Anyway. Well,
I would think so.
Yeah, and that is very, very true, where one partner can sort of take over one set of thing. while the other partner maybe takes over other things. So what I would say for couples where one individual has ADHD, and honestly, I would say this for couples in general, regardless of whether or not there's ADHD, but especially for ADHD, is I would have a conversation with your partner about expectations in the relationship and roles in the relationship. It's not something people talk about explicitly all that much with their partners. It's sort of something that's either kind of just assumed or happens naturally. But I think it can be really helpful to have that conversation where you sort of set up expectations with the understanding that those expectations can change if you need them to change. But say something like, for instance, cleaning, like, hey, I'm not really good at doing this type of cleaning task, or this one's a little bit harder for me to remember. You seem to be really good at it. Would you mind taking this, and then I will take something else? And that might apply to more than just cleaning. It might actually apply to travel, let's say. So if there's one thing that you as the member with ADHD is a little bit better at or has an easier time with, perhaps you can take control over that task if your partner's okay with that, and then the partner can take control over that task that you have a little bit of a harder time with. Because I think what can sometimes feel tricky is if the non-ADHD partner takes over a lot, then the person with ADHD either can feel guilt or shame over the fact that they can't do things, or they can become very comfortable in that dynamic such that it actually reinforces some of their ADHD symptoms. So I think having a conversation can be really helpful, and just remembering that you as someone with ADHD has your own skills. And so if there's something that you feel a little bit more comfortable with, you can advocate for yourself in the relationships to say, maybe that's the thing that I'll do, and then my partner, perhaps, if they're on board, can do some of the other things.
What are some more tips for that partner without ADHD or even friend or other loved one can do to support the person with ADHD in terms of, because I imagine it's hard when you are sharing a household and there's all these different tasks, like with kids or pets or anything like that, and the person without ADHD is getting, as you said, frustrated, and that they have to remind that person, or is there a way to either help them remind them of their tasks or the reminders or the structure, or is it better to kind of be more hands off? Like what does the loved one do in that scenario when they're getting frustrated and the expectations that they talk about are not being met?
Yeah, I would ask them. So that's always my top piece that people actually like forget that they can do, is ask the person with ADHD, what can I do for you? And you can add context to that question. You can even say, and sometimes this kind of lightens the conversation a little bit. You can say, like, I'm sure it doesn't feel good to you when I continue to remind you to do things, and I don't want there to be tension here. So rather than me continually asking, do you think that there might be something that we can come up with that we can do together? Or is there some way in which I can help you that will make this a more efficient conversation? So ask them what they need from you is one thing. The other thing is you can have a conversation with them where you observe what might be difficult to them and say, would you be interested in me helping you try and reorganize that system? So whether it's calendars or time management or something like that. And then basically have a conversation where you're offering your assistance in the way that they can receive it. And that kind of reduces the judgment a little bit, and also reduces some of the sense of like accusation, which can be important. So rather than saying you're being really frustrating because you're not doing X, Y, or Z, is saying, I want to help you, but I'm not quite sure how. Do you have an idea? Is there something that I can do for you that might help with this process? So that's, I think, one piece. Also learning. So I think a lot of times people make a lot of assumptions about ADHD, and not everybody's ADHD is the same. And so I would give your partner with ADHD an opportunity to explain what it's like for them. Like, what are the kinds of things that are easier for them to remember or do, or what makes them overwhelmed? And sometimes when people have been in a relationship for a long time, they assume that they know the answer to that question. But it can be really empowering for the person with ADHD to speak for themselves and to be an advocate for what's going on for their own experience and to talk about what their needs are. And so open up the conversation to them and say, can you tell me a little bit more about what it's like for you? And that can be really validating and just a really great conduit to conversation. Something that's nice too is I do a lot of CBT for ADHD for adults, and for people who pursue that treatment, there's actually a whole dedicated session where you can actually bring in a significant other into the therapy. And some people choose it, some people don't choose it. And, there are other opportunities in treatment to do it, not just in that one specific session of that one specific treatment. But I think if someone is in treatment for ADHD, like a therapy, sometimes even medication too, is if you are in treatment, if you would like to bring your significant other into the therapy and have your provider explain to them a little bit about what it is that you're working on, that can be really helpful for that dynamic too.
So can you tell us more about what CBT for ADHD looks like?
Yeah, so CBT for ADHD is a skills-based treatment for ADHD that's pretty structured. It's typically about 12-ish sessions, give or take. And it's basically a treatment that focuses on the thoughts and feelings and sort of behaviors that are related to ADHD and helping with skills that can help people maximize their abilities. So there are different modules, and each session is focused on a different module, and there are homework assignments where people can apply the techniques that they're learning into their everyday life. So it focuses on themes like time management, task management, planning, organization, and then oftentimes includes pieces related to anxiety because so many people with ADHD also have anxiety. So if that applies, that's a piece that can be introduced in the treatment as well and helps people learn very concrete life skills. So it's like very applicable, it's very practical, and helps them learn different ways that they can overcome barriers or obstacles. And that's really the biggest piece because a lot of people feel like they have so many obstacles in just completing tasks. And so this helps people figure out how to reduce those.
Do you spend much time on motivation?
Yeah.
Because I've heard 3 different possible theories about ADHD. One is that it's a problem with motivation or the motivational system. And I guess related to that is that it's a dopaminergic. There's a theory where there's just decreased levels of dopamine, and in order to get up to a normal level, you have to do more and more extreme things. Mm-hmm. So a lot of novelty seeking. Mm-hmm. And then it also makes boring tasks inconceivably awful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the third I've heard is that it's a sleep issue. And that a lot of ADHD just comes from getting really bad sleep. And so then you're tired and cranky all day long, and it's just really hard to complete things. Do you have any commentary on any of those or whether those aspects come into treatment?
Yeah, so motivation is something that we talk a lot about because you're right, that is a big piece, especially when people don't feel motivated to do the things that are not enjoyable to them or the things that are not novel. So it kind of combines theories 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. And so if they're stimulated more by tasks that are more novel or more exciting or more engaging or sometimes more complicated, then the other tasks are more difficult, and that can be hard to motivate to do. And so what I oftentimes ask, and this is a question I ask in therapy all the time, regardless of whether or not it's ADHD, if someone's having a hard time motivating, I'll ask a really simple, basic question. I'll say, what's your why factor? Why do you want to do it? And that almost becomes a mantra. Whenever you are having a hard time doing something, is ask yourself what your why factor is. Why do you want to get this thing done? Why do you want to clean the bathroom, right? Why do you want to reorganize your closet? Why do you want to put all of your appointments into Google Calendar? Whatever it might be. And sometimes that can help make this really boring or seemingly unuseful task actually resonate a little bit more practically with you. And then if you can figure out what the concrete consequence of why you want to do it is, sometimes it can make it feel a little bit more relevant to your life. Because sometimes these things just don't feel relevant or useful. They feel useless. And so being able to create that sense of almost commitment to something that will actually help you can be really helpful. And then it can kind of create almost this artificial sense of excitement, if you will. Not quite excitement. I don't know that cleaning your toilet's going to be all that exciting, but it kind of creates this sense of mission of okay, I'm going to do this because I know why I'm doing this. And if I get it done, it'll be done and I'll feel good at the end of it, which can be helpful.
Probably feeling a mastery, right? The feeling, at least it's when I finally figured out a to-do list system, I was this was so hard for me, and now I feel like I have something going. So the feeling of pride of overcoming a challenge, maybe.
Exactly. I will say, I think a lot of my depression and anxiety through the years was this gap between I know why I want to write this paper. I know why I want to take this math class or whatever. And I still can't do it. I'm letting myself down continuously. And so I felt like there was some knowledge of the motivation, but maybe, I don't know, maybe it wasn't explicit enough, or it just wasn't motivating enough. I don't know.
Well, that's a great point. Yeah, because you're right, because that's only step one, right? Sometimes you know what your motivation is, but that's not sufficient. That's such a great point, Jacqueline. What I would oftentimes say is that sometimes the problem is not the motivation, but it's the sense of overwhelm that comes with it. And this is like something I hear on a daily basis from people, is this task that they've been avoiding becomes really built up in their mind, where it feels either really cumbersome or it starts to feel anxiety provoking. And then it becomes this big mountain. So rather than seeing like all the different little pieces that you can do, you just see paper. I have to write this paper. And it becomes this like huge, big paper that you need to write, which can feel very overwhelming. And what can be helpful is breaking it down into smaller pieces. And this is where the sort of segmenting things can be very empowering. And so breaking it up into tiny little pieces that give you almost an out, like I only have to do this, like only just write this like one intro paragraph or outline the paper or write citations or whatever it might be, then it feels like, okay, that's something small that I can do, and it feels a lot less overwhelming. And breaking it up into smaller bite-sized pieces can be much easier than just seeing this huge, large mountain that you need to climb.
How can one find a CBT therapist that does ADHD? I mean, knowing how hard it is to kind of find therapy in general, people are just kind of like Googling or Psychology Today. But is there a way that if they want to find like someone with that specialty, they can?
Yeah, so it's tricky because CBT for ADHD is a specialty, both in children and in adults. So there aren't so many people across the country, but rather than creating concern for people who are listening, what I would say is the best bet is to find local neuropsychologists or people that do ADHD assessments in your community and ask them if they themselves do CBT for ADHD or if they know someone who does. So it's much easier to find someone who does ADHD evals. So I would find someone local to you that might be in a medical center local to you. It might be in a clinical or counseling psychology program local to you. It might be at the counseling center of a college if you're at a university, those kinds of things. And so find someone who does evaluation for CBT for ADHD and then start there rather than blindly kind of just looking at general therapists in overall, if that makes sense.
So I have a final sort of two-parter question, and I like to ask this because a lot of our listeners have ADHD, and I think it's really easy whenever we talk about these disorders to fully focus on the negative. But I wanted to know if you've seen a positive side to ADHD. Are there qualities or characteristics that tend to go along with ADHD? Are there any strengths that actually the ADHD itself, gives you? And then the second part to the question is, are there ways, like, do the ways that people with ADHD work, are they necessarily bad or always bad? Or are there some that are actually kind of more adaptive? Or can you like lean into the way that you work with ADHD? An example for me is like, I no longer pull all-nighters, but I have noticed that I work much better in the evenings when there are no scary work emails coming through. That like reduces my anxiety for some reason. I think that's also a sleep pattern thing. And I've also just kind of told myself, like, I'm going to do things at the quote last minute, but that's because that's when I'm most productive. And I'm just not going to beat myself up for not starting super early because I have a long history of actually getting the thing done and it going okay. So I'm going to segment out like 3 nights before and like really hammer it out, take my meds and go. And I'm like, maybe I could do the work to start things earlier, but I'm not sure it's worth it, if that would cause more anxiety, if that would make me rebel more. So yeah, so are there positive sides, and can you ever just like lean into what you've got?
Yeah, so I'm going to address the last piece that you mentioned first, just real quick, before I forget, because you bring up a great point. One of the things I always ask people about ADHD, every single person I work with, is when are you most alert? Like, what time of the day are you most alert? Because that varies. And so if the morning is not the time that you're most alert, then don't do your heaviest cognitive load at that time. And so what I would say, because people don't typically do this, is take a look at your day. Maybe that means diarying your day for a couple of weeks or so to kind of figure out when you work best. And then if you have the flexibility, not everyone has this based on their work schedules and things like that, but if you have any flexibility to tailor when you do your task at certain times, do the tasks that are most cognitively oriented, the ones that require the most thinking and planning at the times when you're most alert, and then the rest of it when you're least alert. So that's one piece that I would say. In terms of skills and strengths and things like that, yes, totally. And I'm glad that you're asking this because it's really important to break some of the stigma around ADHD, because ADHD can actually lead to some of the greatest creativity that I've ever seen. Oftentimes, a lot of people that are sort of idea people who come up with excellent ideas for businesses and things like that, are people with ADHD. And so for a lot of people, they can have these great imaginations or great ways of thinking of new things in new, unique, creative ways that can actually lead to great innovation. And so some of the people that I know that are the greatest innovators are actually people with ADHD. So it's not all bad at all. You can really make it work for you because it's like this really cool superhero power that you might have that can kind of allow you to do all of these really awesome things. And so find ways to lean into it and figure out what you like to do. So if you really enjoy writing, if you really enjoy music, things like that, don't nix that just because you have an accounting job, let's say. Find ways to create avenues for you to do the things that spark joy and spark interest for you and balance it with all the other things that might be either just necessary or responsibilities or more mundane and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess one thing I have to thank ADHD for is I tried going into a career before this that was just so unfulfilling. And I felt like my brain was just like, absolutely not. Like, you are not going to be doing this. There's no way you can make, like, I couldn't even build up the competence to keep going. And then I felt like, it's like, okay, well, the only thing I could do is the thing I'm really passionate about. And so now I felt like I've landed in the place where I really should be because it wasn't even an option to like go in a different, I don't know if that's how it is for everybody, obviously, but sometimes I feel like my brain can point me in the right direction, even if it's a painful kind of process to get there. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess the one thing we do is we ask about resources at the end. So are there any websites, books, blogs, anything like that that you think can be useful to people?
Yeah, so I think that the association, so ABCT, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, they provide a lot of resources on CBT for ADHD and then also things like anxiety and depression as well. So I do recommend those. There are a whole bunch of books on, Amazon and things like that you can find. And so what I would say is there are a couple books, there are a lot, and there's too many to name here, and also different people have different styles. But there are a couple books out there that can really help you hone in on your own ADHD and then also help partners and significant others for ADHD. And so I would definitely recommend taking a look out there because there are a couple of there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I always am so happy when we get an episode with like really concrete tips and skills. So this was really great and helpful. And maybe we'll have you back sometime to talk about one of your other specialties.
That would be wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everybody tune in next week. And as always, don't let your ADHD brains keep you from rating, reviewing, and subscribing to our podcast. Okay. Goodbye. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.